Hey everybody, good morning. This is Dr. Duncan with BI 101. Today's topic is global biodiversity and community structure. This is our next topic on our quest to better understand why biodiversity is so important to our lives and also to understand why Alabama has so many species, why Alabama ranks number 5 in the US for total species and number 1 in the eastern United States. Okay, what we're going to start off with are just some reminders about ways to use this video lecture and the other materials in the course. By now we're in class 4, and now's a good time to sort of check in and think to yourself, am I keeping up with this course or not? Because we are covering a lot of content. If you haven't been keeping up very well and developing your own study system and study guide, then what you probably need to do is dedicate some extra time in the next few days to getting organized. What I'm going to go over here is some tips for how to get organized for any particular class. Just apply that to the other classes. You are not too far behind to do this for your other courses, but if you put this off for too much longer, it's going to be really hard to do this kind of intensive studying for the first exam. Okay, so as I've said before, I recommend that you put in at least 3 hours for each class, and that's outside of watching this video lecture, which is the equivalent of our class time if we were meeting in person. A friendly reminder to check out those breakout group questions before you start watching this video. That way you can have some notes in your notebook about answers to the questions that are going to come up in your breakout groups. That'll help those conversations go more smoothly, and you'll look really smart with in front of your classmates because you'll know all the answers, and can help move that conversation along. Okay, while you're watching this video lecture, I recommend that you take notes during the video lecture and you write those notes in your own words. Don't copy down what I've got on the screen. Use that as inspiration, of course. You can use some of those words, but put them in your own style of explaining things, because that's what's going to make most sense to you in the future when you're studying this material for the exam. Okay? I encourage you to draw sketches, even if it's sort of mimicking what's on the screen, or maybe make charts that help you organize the information, whatever it takes. Okay. Another tip here is to take breaks. This is a long lecture. This is like an 80-minute class, and I'm going to have about 80 minutes of presentation here. Take breaks. That's the benefit of a video lecture, is that you can hit the pause button when you're tired of listening to me and you need a mental break. So take breaks. Use that time to refresh your brain, go do something else, do something fun for a few minutes, call your mom, call your grandparents, something like that. Then come on back to this once you can focus intensely again. The information that you get through watching the video lecture, you should integrate into a study guide for this class. And by class, I don't mean like BI 101. What I mean is like this particular class on biodiversity and communities. That information from this video lecture needs to be integrated with the textbook reading, which is pretty short this time, and any additional videos or vides, as I have written here, on any additional readings, and then in the study guide that I post. So all of that, you don't want to have to go to like 4 or 5 different sources of information when it comes time to studying for the exam. You just want one piece of information, one place to go, one-stop shopping, okay? And that's what you need to develop with your study guide. It's a great way of studying, and the secret to success is that by the time you have created your study guide for a particular class, you will have already learned most of the material, and that means you're way ahead when it comes to the exam. By the way, there's lots of how-to videos and guides online for how to develop study guides and different examples of study guides and that sort of thing. I started to like post a suggested one, and I was like, wow, there's so many good ones out there. Don't bother. So you can go online to see some examples of that. Okay. When you develop your study guide, however, make sure you're doing this point here. Organize it in a way so that you can quiz yourself. So for example, a very simple way to do that is to have a list of terms or concepts in the left-hand column on a page, and then you've got the explanations on the right-hand side of the page. And that way you can fold the paper in half and use it kind of like as a quiz. You can quiz yourself without so that you can't see the answers, because what you need to do is you need to practice forced recall. On the exam, you don't have your notes. So on the exam, you need to be able to answer questions without looking at your notes. So studying when you're studying, best way to study for the exam is forced recall, making yourself do your best to answer a question. And then if you get it right, pat yourself on the back and move along. If you don't, stop, get out some scratch paper and write out the answer again. Writing out the answer, that brings up another point. With study guides, best way to do it is to write it out with your hand. That means using a pen or pencil. With keyboarding, we can type faster than we can really mentally process ideas. So when you're learning, it helps to write things out because that slows you down, makes you think carefully about the idea and how to explain it. This has been reinforced through educational and psychological studies and stuff. So writing things out is the way to go here, okay? Be versatile in your study guides. Use charts, concept maps, drawings, whatever it takes to help you remember this stuff later. Create mnemonics, which are like little tricks to help you remember things, okay? I have some more tips that you can find on Moodle under the study aids section. So go ahead and go there if you want to hear more. Just try some new things every time to find what works best for you and to improve your methods. Don't try to do it all at once, but try to pick off a few new techniques every time, and you'll gradually build up the skills that you need for success in this course. Okay, let's get back to some actual biology here. We're going to start off talking about global biodiversity. So take a look at this graph for a second while I have a sip of tea. Okay, what you're looking at here is a timeline on the x-axis down at the bottom. X-axis is always across the horizontal of a graph. And on the y-axis here, you've got some categories. And what we're measuring here is the number of described species and undescribed species. So what does that mean? You should probably know from your textbook, I think, that a described species is a species that has been formally described by a biologist known as a taxonomist, who describes what it looks like, where it's found, and why it's different from a similar species. It's our way of making sure that when we call something a species, it actually is. That's the study of taxonomy. Okay, and you can see that there's a lot of species that we know exist because we have them in museums and they're sitting in jars and trays and things like that, preserved. But they haven't been described by taxonomists yet, because describing new species takes a long time. It can take months to do that for just one species. So it's a slow process. That's why for a lot of these bars, for a lot of these categories of organisms like insects, especially insects, we've got just about 1 million insect species that have been formally described. And there's like 8 million or more that have actually been collected and are sort of in line waiting to be described. So this illustrates that we've got a lot of work to do on this planet in terms of documenting the different species that are here. Some biologists will do estimates of how many species are probably on the planet based on the trends of discovery with different taxa and that sort of thing. By the way, taxa are different groups of organisms. So insects are one taxa, plants are another taxa. Okay, taxa, you might recognize that root word because I used it just previously in the word taxonomy, or I used it, which is the study of classification of organisms, or in the word taxonomist, which are scientists that do taxonomy. Okay, all right. So I just got distracted there for just a bit. What the conventional estimates are is that we have about 11 million species on the planet. And that's counting these types of organisms, plants and what we consider animals. A lot of folks think of animals as vertebrates, but of course that's also mollusks like clams and snails, and fungi, arachnids, which are spiders and scorpions and mites and things like that. Insects, of course, too. Okay, so throwing all that together, most estimates circle around the figure of about 11 million species on the planet, which is pretty cool because that's a lot of species. but we just don't know for sure. That's the kind of conventional estimates. Just recently, a new study came out. This was in 2017, and it was published by a team of biologists that did some modeling looking at rates of discovery of new species, and they found some pretty staggering trends. They noted to begin with that biologists have described formally about 1.5 million species, and everybody's in agreement that a lot more exists, as we saw in the previous slide. And what these folks did was that they factored in species that are being discovered by looking directly at the DNA. So to the human eye, it looks like the two organisms are the same, but when you look at the DNA, you find that they're different enough to call them separate species. Probably they're living on different islands or in different parts of the world and that sort of thing. So it makes sense that they would be different species from an evolutionary perspective, and we'll get to that in a couple weeks. They also looked at rates of discovery of endosymbionts. Endosymbionts are species that you are very familiar with because these are organisms that live inside you. Those, for example, are your gut bacteria, different species that are inside of you. We have gut bacteria that are distinctly human. The cat of mine, or really my daughter's, who's sitting over there on that table, has bacteria in her gut that are unique to cats, and so forth and so on. When you multiply the numbers of endosymbionts that are specific to a species by the number of species we think that are out there, you'll come up with a big number. So that's 11 million times whatever the number of species of endosymbionts are that are in the guts of these animals. That's a big number. And they also factored in the rate of discovering new bacterial species. Bacteria, of course, are the most plentiful organisms on the planet. They're found, as you'll see, they're found under the ground down to like 5 kilometers beneath our feet. They get blown around by dust in the wind, or with dust in the wind. They're in our guts, they're on our skins, they're all over everywhere. And there's all these different types of environments, so therefore there wind up being like hundreds of millions of bacterial species. So these folks, when they tallied all that up and made projections about how many species might exist out there, they discovered that their mathematical model they created suggested that there might be a final estimate of anywhere from 1 to 6 billion with a B, which is staggering because the conventional estimate is that we'd have about 10 or 11 million with an M of species on the planet, but their final estimate is in the billions. And the average of all their models as they ran them through, because they don't know which one is the one that would be most accurate, when no one will know that for a long time. But their best estimate is that there's about 2.2 billion with a B species on the planet, and they also indicated that they thought that was probably pretty conservative. Okay, all right. So let's move on here to the next topic. Yeah, just exclamation point there, because for all of my career, we've talked about how many species are on the planet. Oh, it's in the millions, and now we're like upgrading that to like billions with a B. So it's pretty staggering, especially to us old timers that have been around a while. Okay, so all these species on the planet, they interact in some pretty incredible ways. And the interactions between these species is what helps make ecosystems function. And we learned about ecosystems in our last class. So for today, what we're going to focus on, for this class, what we're going to now focus on is how species interact with one another. Okay, so this is your introduction to a level of ecology called community ecology. All right, so what is a community and what is community ecology? This illustration on the right nicely hits on this. So we talked in our last class about what an ecosystem is. An ecosystem is all the living and non-living components of an an area. Okay, so this would be an ocean plus the organisms in it, the water, the rocks, that kind of thing. Okay, we can, and we will in one of our coming up classes, we are going to look at biomes, which are collections of ecosystems that are very similar around the world. The biosphere is that layer of Earth just under the surface, a couple kilometers under the surface to a couple kilometers up in the air. It's that boundary around that wraps around the Earth within which life lives. So that's the biosphere. So community is a step down from the ecosystem. We remove the non-living components of our list of things that's in an ecosystem, and what we're left with is all of our animals and plants and etc. And all those living organisms are the community. Okay, just like we talk about a community of people, we usually think about people. We don't think usually about buildings and the ground and stuff like that. I don't know if that works for you or not to help, but there you go. So that's what the community is. We're going to be focusing on that now during this class. In one of our previous classes, when we studied human population growth, we were just looking at the factors that affect one species in an ecosystem. Okay, so that's the population level. And of course, you could zoom all the way down to the individual level. That's kind of self-explanatory, I think. Okay, so these are the different scales in ecology. Make sure that you understand them and the differences between them. All right, so on the left here, I got some things just to highlight what is and what is not a community. It's the living organisms in an area. Communities can be really large areas or they can be very small areas. It can be a natural habitat. It can be an unnatural habitat. I could talk about the community of organisms that are living on the floor in my house, which every once in a while involves some ant or something like that scurrying around, probably a lot of bacteria, maybe a few fungi, things like that. Okay, and that wouldn't be any different for wherever you're living, by the way. That's everywhere. Okay. And so communities, one more point I want to make here before we move on. Communities vary greatly in their species numbers that they have. Think of a desert as having very few species in their community and a tropical rainforest as having a lot, for example. And the species that are in the communities, they have different roles that they play. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. They have different interactions with each other, and some of them wind up having a bigger influence on the overall community than others. Okay, so the field of community ecology is the study of how species are interacting with one another and what factors influence the composition of a community. Why do you have some communities with a lot of species and other communities with fewer species? And why are some communities structured differently? Why do you have like tall forests in some areas and short forests in other areas? What's going on with that? So that's what essentially community ecology is, the study of that. Okay. All right, so let's take a couple minutes here and look at community structure and composition and what factors influence it. On the very general level, climate, which is, of course, the things that are influencing the weather and the availability of water through the atmosphere, rain, and that's your exposure to sunlight, how many hours of sunlight does a spot get during the year, how intense is that sunlight, etc. So that's all climate. Geology is, of course, the rocks and soils that are beneath a community. And also we have to think over long periods of time. How have these organisms interacted over time? How have they influenced the evolution of one another? I know we haven't talked about evolution yet. That's coming up. But essentially, species change through time as they adapt to the environment, because the environment is changing all the time. That's essentially what evolution is. We'll dig into that in more detail. But part of the environment for any organism is other species, and they're interacting all the time and influencing each other's evolution. So all three of these factors help shape community structure and composition. Another important fact is that communities that have higher levels of primary productivity, so that's a term from your ecology class a couple of classes ago. Higher levels of productivity means that you're going to have more species there. So that means more plant growth means that you're going to have more animals living on those plants, more plant species, more animal species, etc. Okay, so that's a general trend we find around the world. Okay, so hang on a second. Yeah, so let me take a pause here because this isn't the slide I expected to see. Okay, I'm back. I had a new figure that somehow I must have accidentally deleted, so I wanted to make sure that was on this slide for you. Okay, so what we're looking at here are some different ways of measuring things in communities. This is just a taste of many different ways ecologists can measure things in communities, but these are some fundamentals that are important. One of them is species richness. That's a term for the number of species that you can find in a community. All you have to do is count up the total numbers of species in that community. So in the two communities that you see depicted here in this cartoon, there are 4 species in each community, okay? Just 4 different species of tree. And you can subdivide that. You can talk about like the species richness of birds in a community, or the species richness of trees or fish or something along those lines, okay? All right, so a second term is species evenness. Species evenness has to do with the number of individuals of each species, and then you look at that pattern across all the species in a community and compare it to another community. I know that was a lot. So let's turn to our handy dandy cartoon here at the bottom that sort of illustrates that for us, okay? So we've got 2 forests down here, community 1. Let me get my laser pointer going on here. Ding. We got community 1 over here on the left. We got community 2 over here on the right. They both have the same species of trees in them, as you see here, okay? But when you look at the numbers of trees of each species in the community, you'll see that there's some differences. So in community 1, there's 25% of all trees are found for each of the species. So let's take this dark green pine tree here, okay? It's 1, 2, 3, 4 out of the 16 trees that we find in that community, okay? But if we look over here to the right, instead of 4, we've got just 2 of these pine trees, okay? So they wind up being 12% or 12.5%, okay, of the total numbers of trees in the community. So what this illustrates then when you run the numbers here is that over here for community 1, you've got a relatively even distribution of the numbers of organisms per each species, right? It's equal, the numbers of organisms, numbers of trees that are in each of these 4 species categories. But over here, we've got one tree species that's really common. It's this one that's kind of got the yellowish canopy here. It's 70% of all trees. Meanwhile, on the other end of the continuum, this tree here, which to me looks like an oak tree, it's only 6% in the community. Those are some big differences, and this is actually more common than what you see at the left, just FYI. But this is showing that this community here has very low level of species evenness. Over here, we have a high level of species evenness because the organisms are distributed evenly across species. Okay, so that's what species evenness means. Now, as you're in an ecology class and reading about these types of terms and the ways that we talk about communities, you're going to hear the term species diversity a lot. COVID. Species diversity is a mathematical combination of both richness and evenness. And you'll be calculating some species diversity in some of your labs later on in the semester from data that you're going to be getting from some local ecosystems. So just set that aside for now to know that it's just a mathematical combination of these 2 factors up here, richness and evenness. That said, and this is one of those confusing points in ecology and biodiversity, when scientists or non-scientists use the term species diversity, they're usually simply meaning species richness. So you'll hear somebody on on a YouTube video that I might post, they say, this ecosystem has high levels of species diversity. They don't mean this. What they mean to say is it's got a lot of species in it. And there's some ambiguity with the use of that term. I'm sorry about that. I wish I could fix it. I've tried to fix it, but the world is big and I'm just one little ecologist and haven't been able to fix that problem. So the point is that you're just going to have to be on your toes a little bit about like when the term is used in this mathematical sense. And I will definitely let you know when I mean it in that sense or when you need to talk about it in that sense. Okay, moving on here. So let's turn now to some of the different organisms that are found in communities and the roles that they play. And we're going to start off with a category of organism called a keystone species. So this is a species that has a disproportionately large impact on the existence of other species in the community. That means that, to put it another way, that species might not be very common in the ecosystem, in the community, but it has a huge impact on everything that goes on there in terms of other species. So a great example of that is this guy on the left here, the gopher tortoise. The gopher tortoise is a reptile. It looks like a turtle, but it's a dryland turtle in a group called the tortoises. They dig burrows. You see it coming out of one of its burrows here. They dig burrows that go under the ground, sometimes like 20, 30 feet or so. It's sandy soil, so it's pretty easy to dig in these ecosystems. And the ecosystems they're found in are the longleaf pine ecosystems of the southeast. And I got a picture of that down here at the bottom center. These are all longleaf pine trees, and longleaf pine trees and their ecosystem are dependent on fire. You see a fire that's creeping through this ecosystem, okay? What the fire is important for, just as an aside, this doesn't have to do with the keystone species, but what the fire is important for is keeping out other tree species from growing in here and crowding out the pines. The pines can't compete with other trees very well, so they depend on the fire to keep out the bullies that would otherwise squeeze them out of the ecosystem. The pines themselves, they can handle the fire just fine. They've got lots of adaptations for doing that. All right, now when these fires come through these ecosystems, that's a problem for things like the gopher tortoise and snakes and frogs and spiders and lizards and even birds and things like that. Well, if you're a large animal like a deer, you just like sort of run on off and avoid the fire. But if you're some of these smaller or slower organisms, the fire could potentially kill you. So the tortoise simply goes down into its burrow. The heat from a fire only goes a few inches beneath the soil surface, so the tortoise is going to be just fine down in its burrow. But as it turns out, when a fire comes through, other species go and join the tortoise in its burrow. Hundreds of other species, I think it's something like 300 other species, have been found sharing the burrows of gopher tortoises during fire times. And even birds have been seen to duck into the tortoise burrows. And so the tortoises wind up creating this very specialized habitat in the ecosystem that would not be there otherwise. And because the tortoise is there, other species are able to survive in this ecosystem that burns every like 2 to 3 years down on the coastal plain, close to the coast. So without the gopher tortoise, a lot of other species would not be able to survive here. So for that reason, we call the tortoise a keystone species. And if you're not familiar with what a keystone is, look that up. Look up keystone in an arch, and that'll explain the concept. Basically, you pull out the keystone from a rock arch, and the whole rock arch falls apart. And the same would be true if we lost the gopher tortoise from these ecosystems. Okay, so that's what a keystone species is. Now, the gopher tortoise has a huge impact on its ecosystem, on its community, obviously, but other species can have even bigger impacts. This guy here, you're probably familiar with, is the beaver. Beavers are like gopher tortoises in that they have a huge impact on the ecosystem, but unlike gopher tortoises, they actually create the community. And the reason that, and the way that they do that is that they build dams on streams, and that backs up the water and creates a pond. And that pond, the ecology of a pond is very different from the ecology of a stream. And for that reason, because beavers are creating a whole different community that would not exist without them, the beaver is considered a foundation species. Okay, that's what your textbook calls them, a foundation species. Other textbooks would call them ecosystem engineers because they are building a whole ecosystem. Okay, so these are two of the players that I want you to understand, two terms for different species in an ecosystem: keystone and foundation species. All right, let's turn now to species interactions. So this chart here, and specifically this portion here on the left, this part here lists the 6 most common types of interactions in an ecosystem. There's actually a couple more than this, but they're pretty rare, so we don't have to pay attention to that. So you're familiar, for example, with predation. That's something that's, you're familiar with, I'm sure. You're probably also familiar with competition, when two species are competing for the same resource. Okay, you're probably familiar with parasites. Maybe you're familiar with mutualisms, when species are helping each other out. Okay, like pollinators in the flowers they pollinate. Commensalism, one species benefits and the other's not affected at all. And then neutral is like the default, like two species don't really have any impact on each other. Okay, your textbook will go through each of these and explain them in detail, and you can certainly find more information online. What I have illustrated for you over here, and you will not find this in your textbook, is a way of listing how the two species in the interaction are influencing one another. Okay, so for example, let's start off with predation here. Okay, in a predatory relationship, one species is benefiting, that's the predator, because it gets to eat. One species is getting negative effects, is having a problem from that relationship, that's the one that's getting eaten. Okay, so the species 2 gets a negative sign here, and species 1 gets a positive sign here. Good for species 1, bad for species 2. Okay. Similarly, let's see if I can clear this stuff out. There we go. Yeah. Similarly, parasitism is the same way. Good for the parasite, bad for the host. All right. Mutualism, good for the bee, good for the flower. All right, so that's what the positives and negatives mean. So you'll need to study some of this on your own. I'm going to pull out 3 of these types of interactions: competition, predation, and parasitism. And we're going to use that as examples in this video lecture. All right, so let's start with competition. So the reason I'm starting with competition is because it is the most common type of interaction. I say one of the most, it's the most common interaction of species on the planet. And it's also one of the most important interactions too. I kind of got that a little bit mixed up, but it's certainly true that competition is both important, one of the most important, and it is the most common. Okay, and the reason that there's competition, and I'm assuming that you understand like what the term competition means in sort of normal conversation, normal parlance. The reason that there is competition is that because resources are limited in the environment. By resources, I mean energy and nutrients. Usually those are in short supply out in ecosystems because they're either just not naturally abundant or other organisms are already using those resources. So for example, if you're a little plant down here in the understory of this forest, you're having a hard time getting light because these big trees up here, the big bullies in the ecosystem, have taken over and they're catching all the light before it reaches the ground down there, and only some light is able to get down to the ground. Okay, so there's an example of competition. Now, species have evolved different strategies to give them an edge over other species. The trees, for example, their strategy is to grow really tall, to get up above the competition so that they can get as much light as they want once they're up there, right? But they got to get there in the first place, and that can take a long time. Plants that are down here in the understory, for example, they might have other strategies. So, for example, they might sprout from the ground very early in the spring before the trees have their leaves so that they can catch that early spring sunlight. Or they might have really big leaves that can capture the little flecks of sun that come through the canopy. Or, and this is also true, they can capture different wavelengths of light and use them for photosynthesis, wavelengths that are more common in the shady understory of a forest and that are not that are just the trees up there just ignore because they're lower in energy, but these plants can use those wavelengths of light. Okay. So that's what I mean here by that species can get an edge over each other in order to survive in ecosystems over time. That's what evolution is all about. Okay. One more point here before we move on, and that is that when two species are competing a lot, in other words, they're very similar to one another in their use of a resource, and that resource is really important to them, then that can lead to what's called competitive exclusion. So this is a good ecology term for you, a new term for you. Competitive exclusion is when one species excludes another from a community through the process of competition, and we're going to look at some examples of that. All right, I didn't mean to suggest that we're about to look at them right now because we're not. Instead, I want you to watch this super cool video about competition between top predators at Yellowstone National Park, grizzly bears and wolves. And when you watch this video, I want you to be able to answer these 4 questions that are here over here with those bullet points. Okay, so you got your link down here, so you can pause this video. You can punch in the URL if you want, or you could download the PowerPoint from Moodle and then copy and paste this URL into your browser. So take a note of the questions, watch the video, answer the questions as you go through the video, and then come back and we will continue this. So you can pause your video lecture now. Okay, assuming you've now watched the video, let's take a look at what some of the take-home messages are. What are the 3 types of interactions depicted? Well, clearly one is competition. That would be between the bears and the, well, we'll get to that in a minute. Competition was one. Predation was another, because we're talking about 2 predators in the ecosystem. That was pretty obvious. A third one not mentioned by the narrator, and you had to look carefully for, was parasitism. We'll talk about parasitism more in just a few minutes, but the example of parasitism were those little birds that were flying around where there was a kill, around the wolf kills or the bear kills. Those birds were trying to snatch a piece of meat from the kill, and they're essentially stealing from the bear or the wolf, and so that's a form of parasitism. Okay. All right, so what were the 3 species that were in competition? The video is mainly about the competition between bears and wolves, but they did mention that there's some conflict with hunters, where humans, hunters early on in the introduction of the wolves complained that the wolves were going to kill off too many elk so that they couldn't do the hunting outside of the park, because these elk herds wander in and out of the park. As it turns out, the elk herds are doing just fine, and there's plenty of elk to hunt even now, these many years later after wolves were introduced. But it's basically 3 species that were in competition for those elk: bears, wolves, and humans. Just as a review, I asked you what are the different trophic levels that you saw indicated in the video. Well, we had plants, the primary producers. We had the elk, which were primary consumers, and we had the bears and the wolves, which when they eat the elk, they are secondary consumers. Okay. All right, and then I asked you about what behaviors and traits you see in the predators and the prey and help them survive. For example, the wolves hunt in packs, and they're very efficient in moving around the landscape because they have long, lanky legs and they're good at running. Bears instead are more powerful ambush predators. They can do short bursts of very fast speeds, up to 30 miles an hour. Never try to outrun a bear. hopefully you won't ever have to even think about should I run or not. But if you are ever encountering a bear in the woods, never run away. That triggers them to chase you down. So that's, you can read more about bear tactics and what to do online. And that was a tangent. But anyway, the point being is that these are different characteristics that these organisms have evolved to accomplish the same task, which is killing an elk and eating an elk. All that to illustrate that there's lots of different ways that organisms can survive in the environment. And those different traits and behaviors we call adaptations, although I didn't write that on the screen here, but because we haven't had evolution yet. We'll be getting to that in just a few minutes. Okay, now to understand competition fully, as well as these other concepts about community ecology, I want to introduce a new term for you. It's called the niche. If you, in French, it would be pronounced niche, but I use the Anglo pronunciation, so it's niche, okay? And the niche is the role a species plays in its environment. I like to think of it as its pattern of living, because it's kind of like everything that species does that kind of makes it unique from other species, different from other species. And that includes everything from the space it occupies, to the food that it eats, to the temperature range in the ecosystem, the conditions for mating, the moisture requirements, blah, 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 blah. Lots of stuff you could list there, okay? It's basically an organism's pattern of living. Now, I'm going to introduce two different categories of niche, and I'm going to start off with fundamental niche, and we're going to get to the second type, the realized niche, in a few minutes. We got a ways to go there, okay? The fundamental niche is the entire niche that an organism is theoretically capable of occupying. So this isn't necessarily where the species is found in nature, it's where the species can possibly survive. And that's a key distinction. Because of competition, the species may not be able to survive everywhere that it is theoretically capable of surviving, because the competition is squeezing it out of some other habitats that it would otherwise be able to occupy. Okay, so the fundamental niche represents that entire range of conditions an organism can occupy, regardless of whether it is there or not. Okay. Now, sometimes the fundamental niches of two species can overlap, and when they do, it's called competition, and they can overlap a lot, or they can overlap a little bit. Let me illustrate that. I got the laser pointer on, so let me illustrate that. So I'm going to draw a circle to represent the niche of a species. That's supposed to represent everything, that all the resources, etc., that a species uses in its environment. Okay. Here's another species niche, a species that competes with it. Okay, they're using mostly a different set of resources, but there is some overlap here. You see that where these circles come together. Okay, so it's right here that the species are they're overlapping. You could think about this, for example, in terms of range of moisture conditions across an ecosystem, and we're talking about plants here. This might be a species that survives in drier conditions, and this might be a species that survives in wetter conditions, but there is a zone of overlap there where they can both survive. That would be where their niches are overlapping, which is right here. Now here's two species instead that would overlap a lot, and that's what I'm trying to illustrate here. And with my really poorly drawn circles, and now I'm trying to fill in the zone of overlap, but it's within both circles. What I'm trying to illustrate here in a really toddler sort of fashion is, with the way that drawing looks, is that these two species are overlapping, their niches are overlapping a lot, which means they're in a lot more competition than these species over here on the left. And in a situation like this, over to the right, you can get the situation where one species excludes another from the environment because there's just too much overlap. Okay, let's move on. All right, so let's talk about competitive exclusion in a little bit more detail with an example here. So remember that competitive exclusion is when one species can outcompete another and push it out of a habitat or sometimes an entire community. In competition theory, no two species with the exact same niche can coexist indefinitely. In other words, if two species are really, really similar, one's going to be the winner and the other's going to get kicked out. There's not enough room in the ecosystem for both of them. And this can lead to a pattern we see in ecosystems called zonation, where you've got, like at a lower elevation, you've got one species, you go slightly higher, you have another species, or something along like that. And if you go for hikes out in nature, you'll see this, that you'll see that species are found in zones across elevational gradients or moisture gradients or things like that. What we see here in the illustration is a salt marsh. This is at the interface between land and an estuary with salty water that you see here to the right. And there are plants that grow at that interface, marsh grasses and sedges. I'll just call them grasses to keep it simple. Um, and what we see in this illustration is that there's some zonation going on. The pink line shows the boundary between the plant to the right and the plant to the left. One's short and brighter green, and the other is taller and more brownish green. Okay, so these species, there's clearly showing some zonation here in this ecosystem, in this community. Now, what's going on here, and we know this because scientists have studied this, is that there's a gradient here in conditions that are favorable for plant growth. On the right, you've got a saltwater bay. You can see that written up there now. And salt is really harsh on plants. Most plants cannot deal with salt at all, or only at very, very trace levels. Only a few plants can tolerate the high levels of salinity that you find along the coast. And these marsh grasses, all of them can tolerate some level of salt. The zone to the left here is the better habitat of the two for just any generic plant. And the reason is that it's more inland, even though it's just by a few feet, it matters for plants. It's more inland, and so it gets more exposure and access to fresh water. So it's shallower, which helps with its growth, and it's also gets more fresh water. So on the left is the prime real estate for plants growing in a salt marsh. Okay, the species at the right, okay, I got ahead of myself. So the species of grass on the left is the dominant competitor. We know from science experiments that it has excluded the other grass species from these habitats on the left. It has pushed them out because it's dominant in its competitive abilities. Okay, the species on the right would love to grow on the left, but it's not competitive enough to do that. It gets its butt kicked by the species that you see on the left here. However, its saving grace is that the species on the right is able to tolerate more of the saltier conditions, and so it's able to live in the zone that's a little bit deeper, and there's a lot more exposure to salt water. So it winds up surviving in the ecosystem, but not in the place that it wants to. So for the species on the right-hand side, its fundamental niche would be the entire range of this ecosystem. Okay, the species on the left, well, we don't know enough about it to say what its fundamental niche is, but its fundamental niche for the species on the left does not include this to the right. Otherwise, it would compete the species there. Outcompete the species there. Okay, in class we're going to do an exercise where we're going to do a theoretical experiment about determining when zonation is caused by competitive exclusion. So just as a heads up for your study notes, leave a little space for some notes that you're going to want to include based on what we talk about in class. All right, now would be a good time to take a pause. I'm going to get some coffee, and you guys might want to pause and take a break, maybe touch up your notes, maybe review and make sure you've gotten everything, and then we'll come back to this in a few minutes. So I'll see you guys in a minute or two. Well, a few seconds for me. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We're going to continue on with our exploration of community ecology, and we're now going to focus on another type of interaction called parasitism. And parasitism is a really fascinating field of science because parasites do all sorts of crazy, kind of creepy stuff to other organisms. We don't have time to get into all that in this class, but I do want to illustrate one form of parasitism, which is really, really cool and underappreciated and really important for the health of our ecosystems. Have you seen these guys before? These are freshwater mussels, or some people might call them clams, but these are organisms that you find out in streams and some lakes in the southeast. And there's lots of different species. In fact, the southeast is the global epicenter of mussel biodiversity. This is something I talked about in the very first class. Something you need to know for the exam. The southeast is the hotspot for mussel biodiversity. Now, we didn't talk at the time about what mussels do in their ecosystem. One of the things that you should know is that they are filter feeders. They take in water. And by the way, I should say that when you see the shells of these organisms, that's the dead organism on the right here. What the shells are protecting is a very soft animal that lives on the inside. These are mollusks. These are bivalves, just like oysters. So if you're familiar with oysters, that squishy part that people like to eat is what you would find inside the clam. Okay. All right, so anyway, what that squishy part does all day long and all night long is that it filters the water. It takes in water inside of it, it filters it out, it separates out the algae and the organic matter that it can digest, and then it excretes the water that's now cleaned, and it also excretes little pellets with sediment. Of any sediment that was in the water, and then that becomes part of the bottom of the stream. Okay, so essentially what these mussels are doing is that they're filtering the water. They're cleaning the water. And in fact, an adult mussel can filter about 12 gallons of water a day, which is pretty remarkable given that these things are small enough to fit inside the palm of your hand. Fortunately, a lot of mussel species are very sensitive to changes in the quality of ecosystems, and we have thrashed our streams and rivers here in the southeast and around the world and have lost a lot of mussel species, and many more are endangered. We'll talk more about that when we get further on in the course. I did want to point out that some of these mussels have some great names. There's pigtoes, there's heel splitters, there's muckets, there's warty backs, and monkey faces. I love that one's my favorite, the Cumberland monkey face. Anyway, so all that to say that we got this tremendous range of mussel species in the southeast. They do some important stuff for us by filtering water to keeping river water clean. Okay, so this is some really good looking mussel habitat here. This is the Etowah River over in Georgia, and it's in a shallow shoals section of the river where you could get out, walk around, and that sort of thing. And nestled into the rocky bottom here of the stream are going to be lots of mussels. Now, mussels. Let's talk about mussel sex. When mussels reproduce, because they don't move around very quickly, they mostly sort of only move a few inches to a few feet during the course of a year. It's really hard for males and females to find each other. So they basically skip all that complexity by releasing their gametes, their egg, into the water. And I should have been more specific. It's only the males that do that. The males basically broadcast their sperm into the water, and the river current or stream current brings that downstream. And during the course of filter feeding, a female mussel will take up some of those sperm, and then the sperm then travel, wherever they go in a mussel. I assume there's like some ovaries or something like that they travel. You know what? I don't know diddly about mussel anatomy, so I'm just going to stop here. All we need to know is that the females take up the sperm, and the sperm fertilize her eggs, and then the female now has young mussel larvae inside of her. Now, if she were to just release them at this point as their larvae, they would drift downstream and they would probably wind up in very inappropriate habitats. Because if you go downstream, the rivers and streams get bigger and bigger. They get wider, they get deeper, they get darker, they get muddier, they get colder, and ultimately wind up in the ocean. Although we have a lot of dams blocking that pathway, they would never make it to the ocean from the Etowah. But suffice it to say that that you can't just go throwing your larvae into the stream and hoping that it's all going to work out, because it won't if you're a mussel. All right. So mussels, female mussels, have some pretty cool tricks for making sure that their larvae stay in the appropriate habitats. And to get at that, I want you to take a look at this picture, and I want you to maybe pause the video for a second and count the number of fish that you see here. Now you're probably thinking that I just lost the thread of the conversation and now we're talking about fish for some reason, but actually this is all tied together. All right. So if you count the number of fish that you see here, let's do that together. I got one fish here on the left, one at the bottom center, another here at the top right, and another right there. But wait a minute, there's not 4 fish here. There's actually only 3. All right, let me roll that back a bit. This one here at the top center is not a fish. I know what you're thinking. You're looking at it and you're like, dude, it's the shape of a fish. There's its eye, clearly. It's got a little snubby nose like a fish might have. It's clearly got some camouflage pattern on it, and it's got some fins out here. Look at that big old tail. Clearly that's a fish, but nope, I'm the expert here. I'm telling you, that's not a fish. That is actually part of a mussel. A mussel, you say? Where's the mussel? Here's the mussel. All right. This is the outline of the mussel right here. Okay, and then this part is all part of it, what's called its mantle, or mantle flaps. This is part of its soft insides that come out when it opens up. Okay, what this female mussel is doing is she has created a lure. She's fishing for fish, just as somebody might go out on a lake and cast, with a rod and reel trying to catch fish. She's trying to catch fish because she's going to parasitize those fish with her larvae so that the fish can then nurture and carry her larvae for a couple of weeks until they're ready to drop to the stream bottom. What I want you to do next is, yep, I covered all that. What I want you to do next is pause this video and watch this YouTube video that shows you, it's like a 3-minute video or so that explains this relationship and has some great imagery that I can't do in a PowerPoint, and explains this parasitic relationship that mussels have with fishes. And I want you to be able to answer these 4 questions. Why does the mussel need the fish? Why is this parasitism? What does the mussel do to fool the fish? And what happens if the fish goes extinct in that river? Okay, so go ahead and pause and watch that video and then come on right back when you're done. Okay, I'm going to assume you've watched the video. Pretty damn cool, huh? That's just one species that they focused on in that video. There are, like I said, there's several hundred species in the southeast, and many of them have some other very elaborate ways of luring fish into this parasitic relationship. One of my favorites is that there's a species of mussel that has this long string of mucus. It's clear mucus. I know mucus gross, but it's this long string of clear mucus that can be up to several feet long. And at the end of that, she's got this packet of larvae that are shaped like a fish. And then a bass or something comes along, takes a bite of that, explodes in its mouth, settles on the gills, the larvae do, and then they drop off in a couple of weeks. So basically, it's like monofilament line with a fishing lure at the end. Mussels have been doing this long before people have. Okay, so let's take a look at what the answers might be to these questions. I hope you've answered them by now and you can compare your notes to mine. So why does the mussel need the fish? Well, the fish helps the mussel larvae stay in the correct habitats in the stream. In some cases, the mussels will release they'll do this at the time of year when fishes are migrating upriver. because that also helps keep the mussels in the right habitats up in the headwaters of the stream. Okay, why is this parasitism? Well, parasitism is when one species takes resources from another species, and the one species, the parasite, benefits and the other species is at a loss. In a more traditional type of parasitic relationship, say, for example, with an intestinal worm, the worm is living in the guts of an organism, and the worm's happy getting lots of resources, lots of food, shelter, safety, movement through the landscape without having to do much work. But the organism is losing resources and so forth. Parasites also include some bacteria and include viruses. COVID-19 is technically a parasite. Parasites are um, parasites are typically not going to kill the host, because if you kill the host too much, you can wind up losing the species you're relying on as a parasite. So usually viruses and other parasites are not lethal. And so usually it's only when there's a fresh evolutionary relationship like we see with COVID-19 do you get a parasite that can actually kill its host. So that's what we're struggling with right now. Here we are in August 2020. Okay, so that's what parasitism is. What does the mussel do to fool the fish? Well, we talked about that. I'm not going to go over that again. But I do want to focus on this. What happens if the fish goes extinct in the wild or in that river? Well, pretty clearly, you lose the mussel as well. This is an example of what's called an extinction cascade. You lose one species and you lose another. And so that's one of the problems that we have in protecting biodiversity on this planet. We've lost a lot of species, and the other species dependent on them are also lost. And in this case, it's the mussels and the fishes. We've lost a lot of fishes from our rivers. Okay, let's move on. All right, so we're about to talk about predation. Now might be a good time to pause, improve your notes on the predation, the parasitism section. Make sure that you've gotten everything you need in there before moving on. Maybe take a little mental break so that you come back at this fresh. My mental break will be a sip of coffee. Okay, let's go. Predation. There's many ways predation is important. I want to focus on two. Number one, predators are part of our ecosystems. They play important roles in our ecosystems, ways that are largely unappreciated or underappreciated by people. And predators also, one of the roles that they play that helps us out is that they keep other populations from getting too big. So for example, back when I had a home that was in a more wooded section of Birmingham, there were gray rat snakes that lived in the neighborhood. And whenever I saw them on my property, I was like, guys, you are welcome to stay here all you want. Eat all the rats and mice and chipmunks you want, because there are too many of them. And so the snakes were doing a service. They were helping me out by keeping down pest populations. Okay, so that's one of the ways that predators can help out people. That's an example of an ecosystem service. We talked about ecosystem services very early in the class. I think it was the first class, and we'll be talking about them again soon. Okay, let's move on. I want to talk about predator-prey populations and how they interact with one another. Predator-prey populations affect one another. If you have a lot of predators, then prey populations go down. If you have a lot of prey, predator populations can increase, okay? And this can happen over both short and long-term periods depending on the species, right? So you could be talking about zooplankton, little tiny floating animals that are eating algae that are floating in a lake or an ocean. These cycles are happening on the scale of hours for them. But for things like the snowshoe hare and the lynx that you see in this picture, that's happening over the scale of years to maybe decades. Okay. Now, if we look at populations of, so I want to look at populations of predator and prey in a little bit more detail here. And what I have here for you is a model of what happens under ideal situations. And by ideal, I don't mean, oh, best situations. No, by ideal, I mean like simplified, where we're only looking at a prey a predator that only eats one prey species and a prey population that's only eaten by one predator species. So this is sort of like our theoretical sort of our theoretical example of like how two species, predator prey, interact when you ignore everything else, and if everything else was simplified to help us understand these dynamics. Okay. What we see here for this model, what we see here on the x-axis is time. And these are just time steps labeled A, B, C, D, and E, okay, to represent different phases of population change for both species. What we see here on the y-axis is population density. So that's the number of organisms per unit area. So for example, it might be the number of rabbits, per acre or per square mile, something like that. And predators would be like the number of bobcats or lynx that are found, per square mile. Okay. And so what I want you to start looking at now is these curves. Let me switch to laser pointer. Otherwise, I'm going to mess this place up fast. This curve here, the brown curve, represents the prey population. And so where the laser pointer is now, the prey population is on a phase of rising, but its population growth rate is slowing down and then peaking here. And you should be thinking about, I saw this before when we talked about population growth. Yes, you did. We talked about how population growth under the logistic growth model, it starts off rapidly for populations. It sort of hits like its running speed, and then it starts slowing down and then sort of plateauing. What we didn't go on to look at there would be what would happen if the population started to crash. So we're looking at that now, and this is showing the prey population going down for reasons we'll get to in just a minute. Okay, so if we had just prey and just predators living in a very simple ecosystem, this is what things would look like. Prey populations would go up, and then predator populations would go up. Okay. These two curves are not randomly placed on this graph. They're actually, one is influencing the other. They're both influencing each other. And let me illustrate that now in more detail. So let's start with situation right here between A and B. Okay, I'm going to start right here at a time when predator populations have come down significantly. Predator populations have crashed and their population density is really low. Prey populations, as a consequence, can start to grow. Because there's very few predators, the green line here is really low. Because there's few predators, prey populations are now getting a break. They can reproduce and lots of their offspring can survive. They're doing well in the ecosystem because there's not as many predators to eat them. So prey populations start to grow, and they grow very rapidly during this phase, right about here along the timeline. But of course, that can't last. The predator populations, which had dipped down here and were really low, because these few predators that are around have access to lots of prey, because there's lots and lots of prey at the time that they're alive, it's easy for them to get prey. It's easy for them to get food. And consequently, lots of their offspring survive, and lots of their offspring are able to have offspring, and so forth and so on. So at some point, and that would be this point on the graph, the predator population starts to rise, and it starts rising quickly and quickly and quickly. Okay, and that's what we see here. Now, because the predator population is getting bigger, the prey population the growth rate starts to slow down. At this point right here at time C, prey populations have peaked. They can't grow anymore because there's so many predators now in the environment that the predators are keeping the prey population in check. And as we go a little bit further, like C plus 1, if you want to think about it like that, the predator population keeps growing. And now there's even more predators, and to the point that prey population growth is negative, in negative territory. And prey populations continue to slide down as predator populations rise and then peak. So here we are now at time D. The predator populations are peaking, but the prey populations are going down. And what we're seeing here is a lag. There's a lag time between when the prey changes its population size, there's a lag time between that and when the predator population responds. So, for example, the peak here of the predator population's density is offset from the peak of the prey population density by a time interval between C and D, whatever that is. I don't know whether this is supposed to be weeks or years or decades, whatever. It doesn't matter. So all this to show that predator and prey populations track one another, but they're not in sync because there's a time delay. It takes time for predators to convert the energy of the prey they eat into new offspring that mature to adulthood. There's that lag phase there that explains the lag between these curves. Okay, to follow it through, as prey populations go down, 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 and crash, that causes predator populations to also come down and crash. Though again, there's that lag as we saw before. So this would be a very dismal time to be either the predator or the prey because both populations are dwindling pretty rapidly. And then we wind up the curves crossing over here. This is where we picked up over here on the left. Okay, so if we were to extend this graph out to the left or the right, we would see these things cycling endlessly. Now, let me remind you that this is an idealized model. This is a simplified model. Most predators eat lots of different species of prey. Most prey are prey to several different species of predators. So in nature, these relationships are noisier. There's a lot more things going on. But this is one of the background patterns that you'll find when you track prey and predator populations in an actual community. All right, and just as a heads up, I'd love to ask about this on the exam. And I often will say, all right, what part of the cycle would you find prey populations increasing and predator populations at a low point? And I might ask you, I might even put this graph on there and ask you some questions about it and that sort of thing. Okay, there's a little hint for you. Okay, so we'll look at this. I forgot that I had this. This is like the kind of question that I like to ask. Okay, so you might pause right here and see if you can answer this question without looking at the graph, and then check the graph and figure out if you got the right answer. So I'll let you pause. Okay, so the question was, when the prey population first begins to decline in number, what is the predator population doing? Well, the correct answer there is that the predator population should be peaking, coming close to peak. And to show that again, as prey population starts to decline, which would be right about here, the predator population is still building, but its population growth rate is slowed down and it's just about to peak. So I would say it's peaking. So the best answer here is B. Okay, hopefully you got that. If not, maybe rewind and watch that section again. All right, so I want to talk now about looking at how these interactions actually play out in real ecosystems, not these idealized ecosystems. And I want to introduce the concept of trophic cascade. You've seen this word trophic before. It's the Latin root, maybe Greek root, I'm not sure. Latin Greek root for feed or eating. So we saw this before with trophic levels. Okay. And so trophic cascades are chains of events in ecosystems where you wind up having population sizes along the food chain affecting one another. Sorry for the misspelling of population over here. Okay, and there's two types of trophic cascades, one is bottom up and the other is top down control. So let's start off with bottom up control, and I'm going to keep going with the lynx and the snowshoe hare example because we had that pretty graphic picture at the beginning of our predator section here. All right, so bottom up control. Let's say that in the ecosystem there's a decline in rainfall, and that leads to a reduction in grasses and wildflowers. Okay, so if there's fewer grasses and wildflowers in the ecosystem, that means there's less food for the rabbits. Okay, if there's less food for the rabbits, also known as hares. Okay, so if there's less food for the hares, then the hares are going to have smaller population sizes. Not as many offspring are going to be born. Of those that are born, not as many are going to survive. And so consequently, there's less food for the lynx, the top predator in this system. And so consequently, lynx populations decline. Okay, so what we've seen here is a very simplistic example of how things that happen at the bottom of the food chain ripple up through the food chain. And the emphasis is on rippling upwards because this is bottom-up control. Now, as you might be anticipating, the other type of trophic cascade is a top-down control. Here's an example of how top-down control could work. Let's say something knocks back the lynx population. Maybe it was fur trapping back in the 1800s, or maybe it's a disease, maybe feline immunity syndrome, which is basically feline AIDS, rips through the population and decimates the population. So there's fewer predators, and what do you think happens to the hare populations? That's right, hare populations are going to increase because there's not as many predators eating them. Hare populations increase. What do you think happens to the grasses and the wildflowers? Yep, you got it. Those populations are going to grow very quickly. So this is an example of top-down control, where the predator, something happens with the predator at the top of the food chain, and it winds up affecting the species at the bottom. Okay, which of these is most common? Well, it really depends on the ecosystem, and it actually depends on the organisms that you look at in the ecosystem, and it depends on what time of year, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, it just depends. Both are very common and in ecosystems. And this is one of the reasons why ecology is, I like to argue that ecology is the most complex of the sciences, because there's so many factors at play here. Everything from climate to geology to varying populations and in weather, varying rainfall, and you throw all that together and you have some very complex systems. Okay, moving on here. All right, so continuing on with our theme of predators, take a moment to think what your answer would be to this question. What species of these four causes the most death and injury to humans? Is it bears? Is it wolves? Is it cougars? Or is it Bambi? Deer? What do you think? Write your answers down, or just remember that, and we'll come back to this in a few minutes. Okay, what I want to talk about now is the role that predators play in our ecosystems, and I want to focus on southeastern ecosystems for a bit. You are probably aware that there are black bear in the southeast. There used to be a lot more black bear. They're coming back in some areas though, so that's a good thing. So black bear are a type of top predator, even though they're omnivores and they mostly eat plants and grubs and stuff like that. They can, for example, kill deer and things like that if they get an opportunity. Another predator you probably are not aware of is the red wolf. The southeast, up until very recently, used to have red wolves everywhere. Now they're reduced to just a small patch on the North Carolina coast, and they're disappearing rapidly. The red wolf has been kind of replaced by an invasive species from the western United States, the coyote. And coyotes are very successful. They're found here in urban Birmingham, and they're found out in the countryside and so forth. So that's another southeastern top predator, is the red wolf, and now supplanted by the coyote. And another predator is the cougar. The southeastern variety of the cougar, subspecies of the cougar, is known as the Florida panther. Sorry, I need a little coffee there. The Florida panther is highly endangered. It's relegated to just the swamplands of very South Florida. But formerly it was found all through Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and into the other states bordering the southeast. But we no longer have panthers like that. We no longer have red wolves like that. We no longer have black bears like we used to. Well, what happened? This guy did it. We did it, we humans. Whereas Native Americans coexisted with these species for thousands and thousands of years with little or no problem. When Europeans and then later Americans spread across the continent, we decimated these populations. Sometimes we did it deliberately by hunting them for their fur. Keep in mind, back before the age of industrial agriculture and cotton production and synthetic fibers and stuff, people did rely on animal furs for staying warm. And then back in the 1800s and stuff, it kind of became like a luxury item, and people like their bearskin rug or their their, I don't know, bobcat hat or whatever. I don't know. I wasn't there. But basically, the fur trade decimated a lot of these populations. People weren't out hunting them with guns. That's too hard. They set out traps that catch these animals by their feet, and then they come along and off them and then skin them. Okay. We also eradicated predators as quote unquote pests. So if you, for example, were a sheep herder in North Carolina and every once in a while you lost a sheep to a cougar or a wolf or something like that, then as you're tending your herds and you have an opportunity to trap or shoot a predator, you take that opportunity. Or sometimes actually states would offer bounties on the skins of predators. They basically said, you bring in the skin of a bear or a bobcat, and we'll pay you like 10 cents or whatever the going rate was at the time. And so by these ways, we eradicated these predators from the landscape. And then there's also a general fear of predators. The idea of walking through a landscape when there might be wolves or bears or cougars around will give us humans some pause. You will want to take some precautions to do that for good reason. And so as a general fear of predators, Europeans and Americans just eradicated them. Remember, the Europeans were coming from a landscape that had been cultivated and domesticated for many, many centuries. And suddenly they were in this landscape with all these crazy beasts roaming around, and they were quite terrified of that. And they would eradicate these species in part out of fear and in part because they were pests. Okay. Now, another major reason why we lost predators in the Southeast is because of loss of habitat. Predators need lots of space because they have to eat a lot of their prey. This goes back to our ecosystem class. Remember, we learned about that 10% rule of thumb of energy that goes from one step in the food chain up to the next. Well, if you're a predator, you're going to have to rely on a large amount of territory to support a large amount of deer for you and your offspring. So when we carved up the landscape for agriculture and the landscape became deforested, we lost a lot of habitat and predators suffered. So these are the big reasons why we lost the predators in the Southeast and in other parts of the world too. As a consequence, the Southeast is overloaded with rabbits and deer and trash pandas and possums and all sorts of other species that the predators would have normally been munching on and keeping those populations in check. And this has consequences for us. I know some people that, for example, just recently are dealing with raccoons in their attic, tearing up the insulation and all that sort of thing. People have problems with rabbits eating their crops and eating their plants in their gardens and stuff. And we have problems with deer. Deer are a huge problem in the Southeast and in the West where their populations have exploded. They go out in the fields and they eat people's crops. They go into forests that are managed for timber and they eat the young seedlings or damage the young trees, as you see here at the top right. And there's also, with these large populations, with any large population, it makes them prone to diseases. And this diseases spread very rapidly through high population densities. You should know that you will get a good handle on that from our labs where you're learning about how viruses spread through populations, okay? Deer are affected by a disease called chronic wasting disease, which has mostly stayed in the northern states. But there's this continual risk that it can spread to the south. The deer in the south have other diseases that plague them. Okay, so these are all some of the consequences that we have to deal with from having too many deer and not enough predators in our world, in our landscape now in the Southeast. And this is just to illustrate deer overpopulation on the left, but on the right, I want to show you some of the ecological effects. This is a picture of a forest where there's a high population of deer. And you'll notice that you could walk through this forest with ease. There's not much vegetation in the understory. And in fact, you don't see much green below about 4 or 5 feet off the ground. That's called a browse line. That's basically as high as a deer can reach and nibble on the plants that are there. And this is a sign of an ecosystem that is in stress because of having too many herbivores, in this case deer. The reason there's too many deer is that nothing's keeping their populations in check. FYI, you can go out to Oak Mountain State Park, which is just to the south of Birmingham, and see this firsthand. You don't have to stick to the trails in Oak Mountain State Park through most of the park. You can just wander where you want because the deer eat the understory, and there's not much brush there. Okay, so this has consequences for other species. It's not just about deer and their predators. Think about the plant populations. This is an exclusion plot where, and I'm sorry the photo's blurry. I don't know why there's not better pictures for me to steal from online, but here you go. This is a picture up here at the top of a plot that has a fence around it. You can see these little fence posts sticking up here. And basically this biologist has fenced the deer out of the plot. And then the biologist also has control plots where the deer have access. And because this will be a good experiment, the biologist will have multiple sets of these throughout the forest. And at the end of the study can compare the species richness and the species evenness and the species diversity of the plots that are where the deer are excluded from, and compare that to the plots where the deer have access to. And it doesn't take much. You don't need a PhD to note that in the plot here with where the deer are not able to reach, there's a lot more plant growth. And all that to illustrate the impact, to visually illustrate the impact that the deer are having on this particular ecosystem. Okay. Now this is more than just affecting plants, it's also affecting other organisms. So here's two species, two of my favorite breeding bird species in the southeast, the hooded warbler and the wood thrush. You might recognize the hooded warbler because that's the little icon I use for my Microsoft like circle. I don't know what it's called. I use the hooded warbler. It's my favorite warbler. And anyway, these two species, the wood thrush and the hooded warbler, they breed in the understory of the forest. They don't go up into the canopy up in the tops of the trees. They're down low, close to the ground in the brushy areas like this. And the problem is that the deer eat all that brush and there's no habitat for these species. So you go to a place like Oak Mountain State Park and you got to work hard in the spring to find a wood thrush or a hooded warbler. Whereas you go to a place like Ruffner Mountain Nature Center, which has the opposite problem. Ruffner Mountain Nature Center is a 1,000-acre park on the east side of Birmingham. I highly recommend you go and visit. We would normally be taking labs out there. But there's hooded warblers and wood thrushes all over the place there. There's no deer. And so there's plenty of vegetation for them to nest in. Okay, so all this to show how the lack of a top predator in the ecosystem causes the prey populations to spike, and then that causes the plant populations to go down, and that has effects on other species, ripple effects. Okay, so back to this question. What species causes the most death and injury to humans? Well, you probably guessed it, that it's the deer. That's right. Little Bambi there is a bigger threat to you or me than a cougar or a grizzly bear. And here's why. It has to do with car collisions. These are some older data. I've looked to see if somebody's updated this kind of study, and I didn't look too hard, but I haven't found anything when I looked more recently. So this is from like around the year 2000. So you can imagine that these numbers are higher now. With wildlife collisions, about 200 people at the time were dying a year in the U.S. as a result of wildlife collisions. Injuries, where a deer comes through your windshield and you lose control of your car and you hit a tree or something like that. Lots of injuries. Over 25,000 a year. We're probably close to 30 by now. Those of you that have car insurance, you are paying higher insurance rates because of this. Insurance companies have to factor this into how they're going to make a buck out of you and me, and they got to know that at least some of us are going to hit deer or other animals and need to get collision repair. And so that leads to higher insurance costs. Over almost 250,000 car accidents a year involving animals, 4% of all accidents at the time. And these numbers are just higher because there's more people on the road, and there's more prey out there as their populations continue to grow. Okay, what I want you to do next is watch one of my most favorite videos to show you all semester. It's a video, we're going to go back to Yellowstone National Park, and it's a video about the introduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park in the 1990s. And there's some really intense, really cool ecology that goes on here. A little thunder there in the background. And in my background. Anyway, I want you to be able to answer these questions. Why did we bring wolves back to Yellowstone National Park? That's answered in the video. How did the wolves affect other animals living in the park? And by this, I mean not just the prey species, the elk. Like what other species were affected by the return of the wolves? And how did wolves cause rivers to change shape? That's right, wolves cause rivers to change shape. So I want you to be able to answer those three questions after watching the video. I'm not going to go through the answers here with you. I think you can handle these on your own, but feel free to ask about this during a review session before the exam, or to email me if you're struggling with that, for sure, or ask questions during class. I want you to do those things. Okay, let's pause here a moment because you need a break, I need a break, and then we'll pick up with this in a few moments. Okay, welcome back. Dr. Duncan here. I'm recording early on a Saturday morning, and there's a thunderstorm rolling through, so you're going to hear some rain and thunder in the background. I love it. All right, so we paused here when we got to community structure and change. What I want to explore with you now is that communities are dynamic. They are always changing. If you go back to an ecosystem that you visited several years ago, you go back now, you will find some changes. Some species are there now that weren't there before. Some species have disappeared. Population sizes of species will have changed and adjusted. And that's just focusing on the community level stuff. You know, things like rainfall and whether it's been a wet few years or a dry few years, that's gonna influence things too. Okay, so there's lots of different reasons why communities are going to change. It has to do with species interactions changing over time. You can lose species, you can gain species. And then there's this other factor here. This is something we haven't yet talked about, which is called ecological disturbances. These, and I'll define this more formally in just a second here, but disturbances are essentially when something affects an ecosystem to change up the availability of resources. And that winds up having ripple effects through the ecosystem, through the community. Okay? And ecological disturbances start the process of succession, which I'll explain in just a moment. All right. First of all, let's look at different types of disturbances that are out there in terms of like different dimensions of them. Disturbances can be really small, like a tree that gets knocked down by a storm during a forest. Just a single tree goes down, and now you've got light coming through the canopy and reaching the understory, and you've got a place for younger trees to grow. So that would be an example of a small disturbance. A large disturbance would be like, Hurricane Laura, which just ripped through the Louisiana and Texas coast, unfortunately. You've got entire forests that have been cut down to the ground by those winds. Those forests will grow back for sure, but it's a pretty dramatic impact. Okay, so that's an example of an ecological disturbance. I need to revise this. 10 years ago or so, when I made this slide, I said global warming as a subtle example of an ecological disturbance. But now we've got so many different types of impacts from global warming that are dramatic that this isn't the best example. But just focus on the fact that for a long time, temperatures on the planet were ratcheting upwards really slowly. and that was very subtle. You couldn't feel it from year to year. You know, for old timers like me, I'm like, yeah, I can feel it now. It's a lot hotter than it was 10 years ago. But when you're young in life, it's harder to have those kinds of reflections. Um, so that would be an example of a subtle impact, a subtle type of disturbance. An intense type of disturbance would be something that happens over a short period of time, like a tornado, or the hurricane could be an example of that too, for sure. Another way to classify disturbances is that they could be abiotic or biotic, meaning that their causal agent is either a living or non-living entity. So a storm is abiotic, like the thunderstorm rolling through as I'm recording this. That's an abiotic storm. Somewhere that lightning hit, if it hit a tree and killed that tree, that would be an example of an abiotic disturbance. A biotic disturbance would be when life, some sort of organism is causing the disturbance. So I have a picture of an elephant here because when I lived in Africa, I saw elephants like tearing the forest to shreds in places, and that was very clearly a disturbance to those forests, a natural part of those of the forest and its disturbance for sure, but it was caused by a living organism, so we call that biotic. So we got abiotic, non-living, and biotic, living. Okay, so all this to say that disturbances come in lots of different shapes and sizes and intensities and so forth and so on. The key thing that unifies them, and here's one of your key messages, is that disturbances change the availability of resources in the environment. Okay, and that's what we get at here. Do you remember from a couple classes ago, HWSS, all right? Heat, water, sunlight, and soil nutrients, okay? Those are the 4 of the resources that are really important for shaping why you have different types of ecosystems. You think about this as a formula, and if you add or subtract from any one of these 4 categories, and you're going to have a different type of ecosystem, okay? Well, disturbances are kind of like the wild card that within the ecosystem, they will come through and they will change this up. Usually not enough to change it to a different ecosystem technically, but enough that you get some turnover in the species that are found at that site where the disturbance had its impact. Okay, I'll give you some examples in just a moment to help clarify that. As a result of the disturbance, it affects the community, the composition of the community. You have some species that are going to decline. So think about the hurricane that just hit the Louisiana coast. Tree populations are now going to be, at least the adult trees are going to be like really low because a lot of those trees have been killed. A lot of wildlife died too. It's really hard to survive a storm of that magnitude, even if you're like a raccoon or something like that, deer, that kind of thing. But so some species are going to decline. But at the same time, the hurricane will create opportunities for other species to thrive. Think about in these forested areas in Louisiana that were hit. You've wiped out the tree canopy. Think of all those plants that live in the understory of the forest that are now going to have lots of sunshine for the rest of this growing season and into the growing seasons of the next few years. They are going to thrive. And so you're going to have a lot of plant species that are going to have a population boom for a few years as a result of the hurricane in the natural areas of the landscape down there. So all this to say that when disturbances impact a community, it is bad for some species and will be good for others. Okay. Now that leads us to this term succession, which I haven't defined for you yet. So here we go. Succession is the sequence of species that colonize, thrive, and then die back in a community following a disturbance. And I know I added a little bit more there, so I'll say that again. The sequence of species that colonize, thrive, and then die back following a disturbance. And what we see is that each species tends to be replaced by another species until things stabilize in what's called a climax ecosystem. And the species that come in later, we call them climax species, and I'll show you that in just a minute. If you're taking this class as an online class, you can ignore this last bullet point because at least in fall 2020, we're not doing that lab. We have a computer simulation, but we're not doing that lab this time. Okay, So let me illustrate how this works. I wish I had an example from the southeast, but I don't. This is a cartoon illustrating um, ecological succession following um, the retreat of a glacier. So glaciers are rivers of ice at high elevations in the mountains or up near the poles where things are continually cold, or at least have been for many millennia. And glaciers, for because because we've been in a warm phase of the planet for several thousand years, glaciers have been slowly retreating, even before humans were causing climate change. Now they're rapidly retreating. Most glaciers are, but for just all this to say that this is a natural event that happens on the planet. We're just now changing things so that this is happening a lot more. Okay. All right, so what happens when a glacier moves over a landscape is that it scrapes everything out of its path. And the only thing left underneath a glacier is like some running water and rock and some hardy species of bacteria that can survive there, okay? But then in a warming climate phase, the glacier melts and it basically retreats. The edge of the glacier retreats back up the valley. If you're not familiar with what a glacier looks like, you might just Google that right now so you get an idea of what that looks like, okay? All right. So as the glacier retreats, it's exposing bare rock, rubble to the sky. Okay. That is new real estate for the ecosystem. That's a place where plants and animals can dwell. But the problem is there's not much there, right? It's just rock, sky, and some water. Well, there are specialized plants that can colonize these areas and eke out a living. And they include lichens and mosses, and that's you see that over here. Lichen. This is the lichen and moss phase. So what just as an aside here, this is a timeline here. I should have pointed that out. Here's our time on the x-axis here. This is showing different stages of ecological succession after the retreat of a glacier. Okay. All right, so after the glacier retreats, you get the exposed rock, and then you get the colonization. Spores of lichen and mosses wind up blowing in, settling on these rocks, and then starting to grow. And they don't grow very tall, but they grow just enough that some organic matter begins to build up. You get just the thinnest of soil layers. It doesn't dry out quite as much in the summer and so forth. And that creates opportunities for small herbs like wildflowers and grasses to establish and grow, and then later on some small shrubs. Okay, so all of this part here, this is what we would say that these plants are called colonizing species. That's up here at the top. Let me get my laser pointer. Come here. There you go. So come on, don't freeze on. There we go. Colonizing species are those species that move in after a disturbance. Some ecological textbooks or ecologists will call them early successional species, or we'll call them pioneer species. And I'm sorry, you've got 3 different terms for that. And I will try to be consistent and call them colonizing species, but I promise you there'll be a few times I'll call them these other categories, okay? AKA stands for also known as. All right, so colonizing species. They are the ones that move in right after disturbance and start establishing an ecosystem, okay? They are tolerant of harsh conditions usually, and they are what we would say they are opportunists. Opportunist species are able to quickly move in and take advantage of resources. In populations of opportunists tend to grow really quickly, then die back after those resources are being used up by more competitive species. Opportunist species tend to be very poor competitors. They get squeezed out of an ecosystem relatively rapidly, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. And part of that is that they can't replace themselves because of that competition. And so they have to, and then a consequence of that, I know I'm kind of skipping ahead. This will all tie together. Bear with me, please. Colonizing species, they have to send their seeds or their spores, their offspring, to new locations because their offspring are not going to be able to colonize and survive in the same places where the parents are. Okay? All right. Let's move on to the next phase in this. So this is a mid-successional phase, and we're now focusing on mid-successional species here in this heath mat phase of the succession and the jack pine phase of the succession, okay? So what has essentially happened is that over the span of many decades of growth of lichen and then small herbs and shrubs, these colonizing species have turned what was before just a rocky environment, turned it into an environment now where it's easier for larger plants to grow. That would be trees, so large shrubs and trees. The heath plants are in the blueberry family, and so we're talking about shrubs here. And then amongst those shrubs, some young trees will get established as their seeds blow out into this shrub habitat, and then they get established and start growing. And what has been happening here all along, but I haven't focused on yet, is a lot of competition. So these small herbs and shrubs, they grow taller and faster than the lichens and the mosses. So they wind up growing over the lichens and mosses and outcompeting them and competitively excluding them from the environment. Okay, so the lichens and mosses, they're really hardy. They're really good at moving through the landscape with their spores and surviving in really harsh conditions, but they suck at competition because they're very simple organisms. And so they wind up getting outcompeted by these bigger plants, who in turn get outcompeted by the heath shrubs that grow taller and bushier and overshade the herbs, the wildflowers, the grasses, and these small shrubs. And even the heath mat will wind up being outcompeted by these young trees that get established and shading them out. You see that there's no shrubs in the understory here. And even some of these mid-successional tree species will get replaced by more longer-lived tree species eventually. And now we're talking about over the scale of centuries, not just years or decades. Okay, so let's move on now to our final phase. This is the climax phase of the ecosystem. Your climax species, the ones that move in later in the successional process, they tend to be the most competitive species, meaning that they're the ones that are going to win in a competitive outcome. So any one of these competitive species, if they're matched with any of these species that came in earlier, the climax species are going to win out of competition. So they're slow to get established and grow, but they're excellent at competition, and they wind up eventually winning over that real estate in the ecosystem. They do, however, have a weakness. They need these more mild conditions, and those mild conditions are created by these species that came before them. Okay. Climax species also have the ability to replace themselves. So in other words, their seeds fall into the shady understory, and they're able to germinate and grow up through the canopy to become a new tree. They don't have to leave the site. That's in contrast to all of these down here. They got to get their seeds or their spores to further upstream where the glacier has revealed more rock, or maybe where there's more lichens and mosses if you're one of these guys. Okay. All right, so that's the process of succession, which is, just roll back and look at a reminder about our definition. It's when you get this turnover of species that creates an ever more complex ecosystem, and it's all as a result of a response to a disturbance. And all along the way, those categories of heat, water, sunlight, and soil are changing. Okay, there's a lot more heat out here where there's no tree canopy. There's a lot more moisture here because you don't have as much direct sunlight, and the moisture is able to stay. And we could go through the other elements of the HWSS and illustrate similar things there. Okay, I need to move on. All right. Now, there are two forms of succession that have to do and have only to do with like what is left after the disturbance. So in a primary succession situation, you start off with a completely new community. The disturbance is so big, it wipes out all life or most life, okay? And so we're talking about major disturbances. Think volcanic eruptions here. Secondary succession is the case where you've got an ecosystem and there's some sort of disturbance, but it doesn't kill off everything. So let's think about southern Louisiana right now after Hurricane Laura. Hurricane wipes out a lot of forest, but if you were to walk there today, 2 days after the hurricane hit, you would still find some live plants in the understory. And they're going to have a rough few weeks, but those surviving plants are going to thrive and they're going to grow, especially because there's no trees above them to hog all the sunshine. And so, all that to illustrate that there are, after the disturbance, the hurricane, there's still plants and animals in the ecosystem. So you're not starting from scratch as you rebuild that community, that ecosystem. And so that's an example of secondary succession. Okay. All right. So this is our last. I think this is our last video for this class. I want you to watch this video on Mount St. Helens eruption. If you ever get a chance to get out to Washington State or Northern Oregon, go to Mount St. Helens National Park. It is so cool. I got to visit there when I was on sabbatical, and I would love to just show you lots of photos that illustrate all this stuff. But then I realized that would just be me just giving you a slideshow about cool things I've seen. Watch this video because they do a good job of teaching you about the eruption and the impact it had on the ecology. And I want you to be able to answer these questions that we have down here. What type of succession was this? Primary or secondary? You probably already know the answer. What type of organisms got succession started in this ecosystem? And there's also a little twist. They don't spend a lot of time on it, but they mention a non-native invasive species that is influencing ecological succession here in the park. What's the impact of that species? And then just put that as a footnote because we're going to study non-native invasive species in one of our labs coming up later on in the semester. So go ahead and pause here and watch the video. Okay, you've watched the video now. Let's do a little bit of review about primary versus secondary succession. These are some examples of each. Primary succession, everything's wiped out. That's volcanic eruptions, landslides, sea level retreat, during a phase of global cooling where the seas drop in their altitude, a glacial retreat like we saw in the cartoons a couple slides ago, and extreme wildfires. Usually wildfires are secondary succession. That's why I put them down here as mild to moderate wildfires. Or a tree getting blown down in a storm like you see over here. This is up here. This is a picture of a landslide in Sierra Leone, which is a country in West Africa. Nothing left there. You've got to start rebuilding forests from scratch. So those are examples of primary and secondary succession. And that, my friends, wraps up our introduction to community ecology. There'll be a couple more new things that we'll cover in class, in our synchronous class. So be sure to be ready to take notes in class or watch the recording from class. That's it. And let me know if anything's unclear and you need some help with any of the concepts that I didn't explain clearly enough.